Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into your fur-lined boots, hoisting your freezing pack, and joining an army about to do something few militaries ever manage: invade itself by accident. The snow is thick, the maps are thin, and honestly, you're pretty sure your general has no idea what he's doing. The sun barely peeks over the horizon, casting a cold, gray light that's less inspiring and more just ominous. Somewhere ahead, there's supposed to be an enemy, but tonight's twist? That enemy might be you. You probably won't survive this without a few bruises to the ego and some awkward dinner conversations later. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward, your breath curling into pale ghosts that vanish into the snowstorm, swallowing the landscape. Around you, hundreds of men in mismatched uniforms grunt and shuffle, trying not to trip over their own numb feet. The Swedish countryside stretches in all directions, a blank sheet of white hiding friend and foe alike. The orders had been clear, or at least, they had been before being shouted down the line half a dozen times, each retelling less coherent than the last. March east, find the enemy, secure the region. Simple enough. But as your commander scans the horizon, squinting past the fluttering snowflakes, you get the sense that maybe, just maybe, he's as lost as the rest of you. Historians still argue whether the original orders were misread, misheard, or just plain stupid from the start. But what's certain is that the Swedish army, under these less than ideal circumstances, is about to bumble straight into a disaster of its own making. You slog on, the snow soaking into your boots and numbing your toes. Your musket feels heavier with each step. Around you, the landscape offers no help, no landmarks, no shelter, just endless white. It's like walking through a dream or a nightmare, depending on how optimistic you are. You hear a distant shout, something about enemy movement ahead. Instinctively, you grip your musket tighter and squint into the gloom. Shapes appear, a cluster of buildings, low and squat, smoke curling from their chimneys. A village. Exactly what you're supposed to find. Adrenaline flares through the ranks. Finally, a target. Finally, something you can fight, or capture, or at least blame for how miserable you are. No one asks too many questions. After all, it's been days since you saw anything other than trees and snow. Supplies are running low. Spirits are even lower. If this is the enemy, best get it over with quickly. You charge, or more accurately, you stumble en masse, toward the village. Your comrades shout and wave swords and pikes in the air, trying to look menacing while not slipping on the icy ground. As you get closer, the village looks oddly familiar. The flags don't look foreign. The buildings look distinctly Swedish. But you push that thought aside. Maybe the enemy stole them. Or maybe you're just cold and seeing things. It isn't until you're nearly on top of the place that someone, probably the same guy who once mistook a haystack for a bear, whispers, guys? I think this is one of ours. But it's too late. The army surges forward. Doors are kicked in. Barns are raided. Cows moo in protest. Villagers scream and scatter, some grabbing pitchforks, others hiding behind barrels and wagons. A boy pelts you with a snowball, which frankly feels a little insulting. You break into a farmhouse, expecting enemy soldiers, and instead find a terrified old woman clutching a ladle. Awkward. Outside, the chaos rages on. One of your friends rides by on a goat, because apparently horses are for people who didn't lose their minds 2 villages back. Historians still argue about whether the soldiers genuinely didn't realize they were attacking fellow Swedes, or if they knew and just didn't care at that point. Starvation and frostbite, after all, are powerful motivators to bend logic. You lower your musket and meet the old woman's bewildered gaze. She mutters something about idiots and outsiders. You have no rebuttal. She's not wrong. By the time the sun finally gives up and sinks behind the horizon, the enemy village lies in a state of confused devastation. Looted, but not burned. Defended, but not really harmed. It's a mess of embarrassed soldiers and angry villagers, all shivering in the same miserable winter. And somehow, your commander still thinks this counts as a victory. You trudge back through the mess, the snow already starting to cover up the footprints and the shattered pride left behind. Orders barked out over the howling wind tell you to dig in, set up camp just outside the village, you know, the one you just sacked. There's something almost poetic about raiding a place and then sleeping a few yards away, as if hoping the villagers might forgive you by morning. Spoiler, they won't. The wind claws at your cloak, sneaking cold fingers down your neck. You stomp your feet, trying to get some feeling back, but the blizzard has settled in now, thicker and nastier than before. Visibility? Let's just say you're more likely to spot a unicorn than your own hand. Historians still argue whether the winter that year was unusually brutal or just business as usual for Sweden. Either way, it's the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays there, a clingy, unwelcome guest. Some soldiers grumble about frostbite. Others, not so lucky, sit motionless, too tired or too frozen to care anymore. Your commanders, meanwhile, are huddled over a map that looks more like a piece of modern art than a navigational tool. Swirls, dots, half-sketched rivers, one even swears the thing's upside down. But no one dares to correct him. Not after the last guy who tried ended up digging latrine pits until his fingers turned blue. You realize, as you watch the officers argue, that maps back then weren't exactly reliable. They were based on a lot of guesswork, second-hand stories, and the occasional wild rumor. Here be dragons wasn't just a joke, it was genuine cartographic advice in some corners. You sit down on a crate that might have once held gunpowder, or fish, it's hard to tell in the dark, and pull your cloak tighter. Somewhere to the west, or was it the north, the real enemy is waiting. Probably. Hopefully. You're starting to wonder if maybe this whole war is a misunderstanding, like two dogs barking at each other across a fence without realizing they're tied to the same post. As the night drags on, a few brave souls attempt to cook something vaguely edible. The smell of charred meat, rabbit, maybe, or rat, wafts through the camp. You think about asking for a bite but decide your pride's had enough bruising today. The blizzard shows no signs of letting up. Tents flap madly, snapping at their ropes like wild animals. Some soldiers give up entirely and just burrow into snowbanks, hoping body heat and sheer stubbornness will keep them alive until morning. You laugh, but your face is too frozen for expressions. You glance back toward the village. A few windows glow faintly with candlelight. You imagine the villagers inside, huddled around their hearths, muttering curses about the fools who couldn't even recognize their own countrymen. Honestly, fair point. One officer, a particularly plump fellow whose main battle seems to be with his waistcoat buttons, tries to rouse the men with a rousing speech. Something about glory and honor and the eternal gratitude of the kingdom. It would be stirring if his words didn't get immediately swallowed by the shrieking wind. Historians still argue whether morale during this campaign was salvageable or already circling the drain. From your frosty perch, it feels like the latter. You settle in, shivering and half asleep, dreaming of hot baths, warm beds, and wars fought in places where the biggest enemy isn't the weather. Tomorrow, you think, has to be better. It isn't. Morning stumbles in gray and heavy, like a drunk neighbor showing up uninvited. You pry your eyes open to a world still blanketed in snow, still roaring with wind, still, miraculously, worse than yesterday. Your joints creak as you stand, and for a moment, you wonder if your legs will simply refuse. They consider it, but ultimately agree to cooperate, just barely. Someone tries to organize breakfast, but there's not much to organize. Most of the supplies got lost somewhere between March East and Raid Innocent Village. Hardtack frozen solid, a few questionable strips of dried meat, and water that's now basically ice in a bottle. If it sounds glamorous, congratulations, you're officially ready for 17th century warfare. The commanders gather again, huddling over that cursed map like it might reveal secrets if they just stare hard enough. You shuffle closer, curious despite yourself. The thing is a disaster, squiggly rivers veering into nowhere, mountains that look suspiciously like smudges, towns plotted at what must be random intervals. You wouldn't trust this thing to get you to the end of your own street, let alone through a military campaign. Historians still argue whether Swedish military maps of the time were genuinely this bad or if the officers were just bad at reading them. Frankly, both seem equally likely. Today's new plan, keep marching. East, west, somewhere. Doesn't really matter. The important thing is to move. Sitting still is dangerous, more men freeze that way. So you pack up, sling your gear over your shoulder, and join the shuffling column heading toward another indistinct, snow-smothered horizon. A few hours in, you realize the path looks suspiciously familiar. That rock formation, you swear you saw it yesterday. Maybe even raided it for firewood. You squint through the snowfall, trying to make sense of it all, but the world is a dizzying, swirling mess. Up could be down for all you know. And then comes the whisper through the ranks, "We're lost." You can't say you're surprised. Disappointed, sure, but not surprised. You march anyway because what else is there to do? The line snakes through a frozen forest, crunching through knee-deep drifts. Frost clings to every tree branch, and the silence is eerie, broken only by the occasional crack of ice or the soft curses of soldiers too cold to care about decorum. A sudden commotion up ahead, some unseen movement. Shouts ripple back through the ranks. Weapons are readied. You clutch your musket, heart thudding against your ribs. Maybe, finally, the enemy. You reach the front line and squint into the gloom. Shapes emerge, figures trudging through the snow, bundled in cloaks and armor that looks, well, familiar. Suspiciously familiar. And then it hits you. You're looking at another detachment of your own army. Different division, same flag, same frozen skull plastered across equally miserable faces. Historians still argue whether the two sides recognized each other right away or just hesitated long enough to avoid a bloodbath. Either way, disaster is narrowly avoided. A few awkward laughs, a couple of shouted greetings. One soldier even waves. The rest of you just shuffle past each other like two confused herds of particularly grumpy sheep. The commanders hold a brief, heated conference, lots of finger-pointing and increasingly loud muttering. In the end, no one can figure out who's more lost, so you both agree to pretend it didn't happen and keep going in opposite directions. You plod on, comforted only by the thought that somewhere, someone is having an even worse day than you. Of course, that someone is probably another Swedish soldier, equally cold, equally lost, equally regretting life choices. By late afternoon, the snow lets up just enough for you to see something on the horizon, a village, smoke curling lazily from chimneys. Hope stirs in your chest. Shelter, food, maybe even a warm fire. You and your comrades surge forward, eager but wary. After yesterday's fiasco, no one's taking chances. Scouts are sent ahead, the rest of you form a rough perimeter. The scouts return, faces drawn and uncertain. They're not sure. The village looks Swedish. Again. But it could be enemy occupied. Could be a trap. Could be anything, really. The commanders hesitate. Attack? Negotiate? Wait? Historians still argue about this moment, whether it was genuine caution or sheer indecision that sealed the day's fate. In the end, you do what you do best, blunder forward. You blunder forward because, honestly, what else can you do at this point? There's a strange momentum to it. Once you've tripped and fallen halfway down the hill of bad decisions, gravity's really doing most of the work. The village looms larger as you approach, low wooden houses, thatch roofs sagging under the weight of fresh snow, smoke winding upward in lazy spirals. The same unsettling familiarity prickles at your skin. It looks Swedish. It feels Swedish. You think you even recognize the scent, wood smoke, wet hay, and that very specific odor of people who haven't bathed since last midsummer. Still, orders are orders, and you don't exactly have a reputation to lose anymore. So you grit your teeth, adjust your grip on your musket, and follow the rest of the army into the village like a very cold, very confused swarm of locusts. Doors slam. Curtains twitch. Villagers vanish inside their homes like spooked rabbits. A dog barks, then thinks better of it and retreats under a cart. No resistance. No enemy troops. No traps. Just terrified civilians watching from behind shuttered windows as a bunch of half-frozen soldiers slosh through their streets, slipping occasionally on patches of ice and dignity. Historians still argue whether this was a full-on raid or more of an accidental occupation. Technically, you're not looting anything, yet, but you're certainly not making yourselves at home. Your commander, clearly believing in the ask forgiveness, not permission school of leadership, orders a few homes commandeered as temporary shelter. Officers spread out to requisition supplies, which is a very polite way of saying take things without asking. You find yourself billeted in a farmhouse on the village outskirts. It's small, drafty, and smells like turnips, but it's better than the snowbank you slept in last night. The family who lives there eyes you warily, a mixture of fear and simmering resentment. You attempt a smile. It does not go well. Pretty sure your face has frozen in a permanent scowl. As the evening settles in, you start to notice how familiar everything feels. The way the houses are built, the accents of the villagers. Even the local dialect matches your own. You could almost swear you're back in your own village. Almost. Still, You shake it off. Coincidence. Sweden's a big place, or at least, big enough that you can still get lost in it. The commanders, meanwhile, gather for a feast of sorts. One of them managed to procure a goose, another some stale bread. There's even a barrel of weak meat that someone definitely didn't pay for. You're not invited to the high table, of course. Privates like you get the scraps. But there's a certain comfort in the background hum of voices and the occasional burst of laughter, an oasis of almost normalcy in an otherwise miserable campaign. You lean against the wall, savoring the warmth of the fire and trying not to think too hard about tomorrow. That's when the door bursts open and a group of villagers storms in, not with weapons, but with bowls of steaming stew. You blink, confused. So does everyone else. The villagers set the bowls down with a clatter, mutter a few grudging words, and retreat just as quickly, leaving the smell of cabbage and mystery meat hanging in the air. You glance around. Is this a trap? Poison stew? Or just extremely reluctant hospitality? Historians still argue whether the villagers hoped to bribe you into leaving or just figured feeding you would make you slightly less destructive houseguests. Either way, you're not about to turn down hot food. You grab a bowl, the heat searing your fingertips through the thin ceramic, and take a tentative sip. It's salty, suspiciously chewy, and the best thing you've tasted in weeks. The room fills with the soft clatter of spoons and the occasional sigh of pleasure. For a brief moment, the war, the cold, the confusion, all of it fades into the background. You catch the eye of an old man sitting by the hearth. He gives you a nod. Not friendly, exactly. More like the nod one gives to a particularly stupid dog that nonetheless managed to find its way home. You nod back, feeling, absurdly, like you've just brokered some kind of unspoken truce. And for tonight, at least, that's enough. The next morning, you wake up to the sound of hooves clattering on icy cobblestones and the low murmur of voices outside. Blinking against the dull, watery sunlight streaming through the frosty window, you peel yourself off the straw mattress and stagger to the door. Outside, a scene of cautious cohabitation unfolds. Soldiers shuffle about, trying to look busy without being threatening. Villagers move stiffly between homes and barns, casting wary glances your way. It's not exactly peace, but it's a far cry from yesterday's chaos. Then you notice something odd. No guards posted, no defensive formations. The village, it seems, is already part of Sweden. You're Sweden. You feel the creeping, familiar embarrassment crawl up your spine. It hits different in the daylight. The village's flag flutters limply on the pole by the town hall, your flag. Not just similar, identical. And slowly, awkwardly, word begins to spread. Soldiers muttering to one another, officers sharing stiff, tight-lipped glances. The realization bubbles up like swamp gas. You're occupying one of your own towns. Again. Historians still argue whether it was pure incompetence or just an honest mistake in an era where navigation mostly meant hope you don't die before you figure out where you are. Either way, congratulations, you've now managed to conquer your own people. Twice. Your commander gathers the troops in the square, trying to make it look like a planned assembly and not a sham convention. He clears his throat, glances nervously at his lieutenants, and begins a speech so stuffed with vague platitudes that it could have been written by a particularly uninspired politician. You stand there, swaying slightly from exhaustion, barely listening. You're too busy watching the villagers peering from their doorways, their expressions a perfect blend of irritation and smugness. Somewhere, a child is very obviously sticking his tongue out at you. As the speech drones on, you hear a loud clatter behind you. Turning, you see one of the younger villagers dragging a cart stacked high with bread, smoked fish, and, glorious sight, a small keg of beer. The soldiers part like the Red Sea, watching as the boy trundles the cart straight toward the commanders. Your general pauses mid-sentence, blinking at the offering. There's a tense beat of silence. Then, in a voice thick with suspicion, he asks, "What's this?" The boy shrugs and replies, in crisp, unaccented Swedish, "Peace offering." Or bribe. Depends how you look at it. You almost choke trying to hold in a laugh. A few of your comrades aren't so successful, stifled chuckles rippling through the ranks. Historians still argue whether this moment counts as one of the earliest examples of peace through snacks. Regardless, the general, realizing there's no graceful way out, mutters something about honoring the generosity of the people and waves the cart toward the mess tent. And just like that, the tension breaks. Soon enough, soldiers and villagers are cautiously mingling. Someone breaks out a loot. A few men start a snowball fight, which escalates with alarming speed and ends with 3 officers buried up to their necks in snowbanks. You sip watered-down beer, watching the surreal scene unfold, half expecting reality to snap back into focus any second. But it doesn't. Instead, you find yourself sitting on a stump by the fire, sharing a bowl of stew with the same old man who had nodded at you the night before. He introduces himself with a name you immediately forget, then launches into a story about the harsh winters of his youth, as if you weren't already living through one. The fire crackles, the stew steams, and for a while, it feels like the war is a distant rumor rather than a biting reality. As the sun dips behind the trees and the cold sharpens again, you realize something. Nobody wants to be the first to break the peace. The villagers don't want more fighting. Neither do you. Frankly, nobody has the energy. You lean back, gazing up at the snow-heavy sky. Somewhere, a soldier is attempting, badly, to sing a love song, his voice cracking like frozen branches. A few villagers join in, and soon the whole camp is a lopsided chorus of weary men and wary civilians trying to pretend, if only for tonight, that they aren't part of a bizarre, embarrassing military blunder. Historians still argue whether the accidental truce was genuine goodwill or just collective exhaustion. You figure it doesn't really matter. Warm stew, bad singing, and no one trying to stab you, sometimes, that's victory enough. The next day dawns with a reluctant grayness, the kind that promises nothing good but doesn't quite deliver catastrophe either. You shuffle out of the farmhouse, joints aching from both cold and the lumpy mattress that seems to have been stuffed with rocks. The village is stirring, smoke curling lazily from chimneys, and a surprising number of soldiers are already up, clustered around fires or attempting to look useful by stacking logs and fixing carts they definitely broke yesterday. But there's a new wrinkle. A messenger has arrived. He's easy to spot, smaller horse, better coat, expression halfway between panic and nausea. The poor soul weaves through the camp, clutching a thick envelope like it might explode. When he reaches the commanders, there's a lot of frowning and muttering. You watch as one officer turns slightly green around the gills. Another one actually slaps his forehead, hard enough that even the villagers flinch. Historians still argue whether this particular message was the catalyst for what came next or if the damage was already beyond fixing. Either way, when the general finally gathers the troops, you know it's not going to be good. You line up in the icy mud, trying to look attentive. Your musket leans heavy against your shoulder, the metal cold enough to burn bare skin. The general clears his throat. "Man," he begins, voice already weary, "there has been a misunderstanding. You could cut the tension with a butter knife. This village," he continues, pausing as if hoping someone will interrupt and save him the embarrassment, "is not enemy territory." No gasp of shock. No murmurs of disbelief. Just a long, collective sigh, like an entire army exhaling at once in bitter, exhausted agreement. "Further," he says, his voice dropping even lower, "it falls under our own jurisdiction. We are, in effect, occupying ourselves." This time there is a reaction. A few snorts of laughter, quickly stifled. Someone coughs suspiciously loud. You bite your cheek, because the last thing you need is latrine duty until spring thaw. Your general straightens, tugging at his coat like he can hide inside it. "We will, effective immediately, withdraw from the village and return to," he checks a piece of paper, squints, and mutters, "our actual target." Where that is, no one seems terribly sure. The withdrawal is a haphazard affair. Soldiers, still munching on donated bread and sipping lukewarm beer, shuffle toward the road. Villagers watch from doorways, arms crossed, expressions equal parts relief and smug satisfaction. You can almost hear them thinking, "Good riddance, you frozen idiots." You pack your gear, which really just means trying to wrestle your belongings into something resembling a bundle and tying it off with a rope that frays dangerously under tension. The old man you shared stew with gives you a curt nod as you pass. You nod back, resisting the urge to apologize out loud. Somehow, that would make it worse. As you and your comrades slosh out of the village, boots squelching in the half-frozen slush, a few brave kids trail behind, throwing snowballs at your retreating backs. You're too tired to care, and honestly, you kind of deserve it. Historians still argue whether the Army's official records ever even acknowledged this debacle. If they did, it was buried under a mountain of bureaucratic doublespeak and strategic jargon. Something about unauthorized engagements with local populations and temporary territorial oversight. You trudge on, back into the wasteland of snow and scrubby trees, feeling less like an army and more like a traveling circus that lost its tent. The cold bites harder now that the temporary shelter of the village is behind you. Every gust of wind feels personal, like the weather itself is mocking your entire existence. One soldier breaks the silence. "Think we'll find the enemy today?" You glance sideways at him. He's got a crooked grin and a black eye from last night's snowball fight. Apparently, things got very competitive after you went to sleep. "Only if they're dumber than we are," you reply, voice rasping in the cold air. Another soldier laughs, a dry, brittle sound. "So, probably not." The column stretches ahead and behind, a sad, shuffling snake of men trying to remember why they signed up for this in the first place. Glory? Adventure? Definitely wasn't the cuisine. You keep marching, boots heavy with slush, musket bouncing against your back, breath steaming in ragged clouds. The landscape stretches out, white and gray and utterly indifferent. Somewhere out there, presumably, the real enemy is waiting. But right now, the only battle you're fighting is the one against your own increasingly vocal regret. You march until your legs feel like stiff, frozen stilts and your brain buzzes with that numb, half-dreamy exhaustion where even stupid ideas start sounding good. Like maybe lying down right here in the snow. Just for a minute. Just until spring. But no, you keep moving because everyone else is, and nobody wants to be the first one to fall over. You glance up. The sky's that low, heavy gray that promises more snow. Maybe a blizzard. Maybe the heavens just giving up and dropping a big frozen shrug on your entire life. The day drags on in a blur of trudging, slipping, cursing, and the occasional officer barking vague orders that mostly amount to keep moving. And then, as if summoned by collective despair, another village materializes out of the haze. Same squat houses. Same threadbare flags. Same telltale signs of habitation, smoke, chickens pecking desperately in frozen yards, dogs that look more miserable than hostile. You hear a few soldiers muttering. Some want to go around. Others argue it's probably enemy occupied. The officers have a heated debate that involves a lot of pointing at the map and swearing at each other under their breath. Historians still argue whether this new blunder was due to pressure from above, march faster, win quicker, freeze less, or just sheer bad luck. Regardless, the decision is made, advance. You tighten your grip on your musket. Once again, you march straight toward what might be the enemy. Or, more of yourselves. You're getting used to the taste of bitter irony. The village, sensing an approaching army, reacts predictably. Doors slam. Windows shutter. A rooster, confused and outnumbered, scurries under a porch. As you get closer, something catches your eye, a familiar crest hanging crookedly on the town hall. A crest you've seen before. Recently. On your supplies. Your stomach sinks. Your brain, still sluggish from cold and hunger, finally does the math. You're about to invade yourselves. Again. Historians still argue whether this was an actual invasion or just a very aggressive misunderstanding. At the time, though, you don't have the luxury of philosophical debate. You're already too far committed, a mass of snow-caked men shuffling toward yet another awkward headline for future historians. Then, miracle of miracles, someone, likely the one officer who hasn't completely frozen his brain, halts the column. There's a shouted order. A hand raised high. The line stumbles to a halt, like a drunk trying to remember where he parked. An officer, riding a horse that looks just as done with this campaign as you are, rides forward with a white cloth tied to the end of a broken spear. Parley. You watch as he approaches the village at a slow, cautious walk. A tense minute passes. 2. Finally, a door creaks open, and an elderly man steps out, hands raised. The officer and the villager meet halfway between the lines, exchanging terse words you can't quite hear. Gestures are made. Papers are produced. More muttering. The rest of you stand there, weapons at the ready, shivering not just from cold now but from sheer anticipation of how badly this could go. And then, relief. The officer turns back, waving the white cloth triumphantly. Not an enemy. Not a target. Not another episode of how to lose friends and embarrass your nation. You let out a breath you didn't know you were holding, and a few soldiers actually cheer, weakly, like they don't want to jinx it. Instead of storming the village, you're ushered in politely, as one might invite a neighbor who's wandered onto your property and looks a bit too cold to scold properly. Turns out, this village, like the last, has no interest in being a battlefield. The villagers feed you what little they have, Thin porridge, dried fish, weak beer. You eat gratefully, trying not to think about how close you came to repeating history's least impressive military maneuver. Around the fires that night, soldiers joke, tentatively, about the day's near miss. Someone suggests renaming the army to the self-invading regiment. Another jokes about promoting the general to commander of confusion. You don't laugh out loud, but the corner of your mouth twitches upward. It's not much, but it's the first genuine smile you've managed in weeks. Historians still argue whether this accidental diplomacy was genius strategy or dumb luck. Either way, it works. You're not dead, you're not fighting your neighbors, and for the first time in days, the night feels just a little less brutal. You huddle closer to the fire, savoring the faint warmth, the bad beer, and the even worse singing. Somewhere out there, the real war still rages. But tonight, at least, you've managed to avoid adding another chapter to the grand saga of Sweden invading itself. And honestly, that feels like a win. You wake the next morning to a strange sound, silence. No howling wind, no creaking wood, no officers bellowing contradictory orders. Just the soft, cautious stirrings of a camp still not sure whether today will bring survival or another installment of accidental self-destruction. You stretch, wincing at the sharp stab of cold in your joints. The fire's died down to embers, and the porridge pot is crusted with yesterday's memories. You're not complaining. Not after what could have happened. Outside, the landscape is blanketed under a thick, fresh layer of snow, so pure, so pristine, it almost dares you to mess it up again. You trudge through it, boots making that muffled crunch-crunch, toward the gathering soldiers. Another meeting, another argument over the map. Historians still argue whether maps of the 17th century were tragically inaccurate or if Swedish officers were just particularly cursed. The thing they're huddled over now might be a map, but it also might be an exceptionally lazy doodle. Rivers curve impossibly. Mountains sit where mountains very much are not. And cities are either wildly misplaced or just wishful thinking. There's talk of moving out, again, before the snow thickens into something truly life-threatening. The villagers look on from their doorsteps, some with arms crossed, some with expressions that say, "Please leave before you get us all accidentally annexed." The general finally makes the call, we march east. Maybe. Probably. You shoulder your pack, heavy with everything and nothing, and follow the slow, weary line of men trudging out of the village. It's almost ritualistic by now, the shuffle of boots, the low grumbling, the occasional sneeze echoing embarrassingly loud in the cold air. Hours pass. Maybe more. Time has no meaning here. Just snow and more snow and the occasional desperate hope that someone, somewhere, knows where the enemy actually is. Then a shout ripples down the line. Another village spotted ahead. You resist the urge to scream. The officers pause, form a quick council of the very confused, and finally, perhaps out of sheer exhaustion, send a scout ahead this time. Small victories. You sit down on a rock, grateful for the rest, and watch the scout disappear into the trees. Snowflakes drift lazily around you, catching in your hair and eyelashes. Another soldier flops down beside you, pulling his cloak tighter. He glances sideways and mutters, "Bet you a week's rations it's ours again." You snort, shaking your head. "No bet. I'm not that desperate." Historians still argue whether the Swedish army was uniquely unlucky or just victims of the vast, confusing sprawl that was early modern Sweden, a patchwork of territories stitched together by custom, compromise, and a lot of wishful thinking. The scout returns after what feels like an eternity, his face unreadable under layers of frost and fatigue. He leans in, whispers to the officers. More muttering, more frowns. The decision comes back down the line, not enemy. Not to be touched. You sag with relief, the kind that makes you realize how tense you've been for days. As the army prepares to circle around the village, someone up front starts laughing. Loud, hearty, almost hysterical. It ripples backward like a contagion. Soon you're chuckling too, your breath coming in short, misty puffs. It's not funny, not really. But it's either laugh or cry, and laughing's warmer. By the time you bypass the village, you're lightheaded with it, giggling like a madman under your breath. A few villagers peer out, frowning in confusion at the sight of an army giggling its way past their gates. If they only knew. You march on, the snow thickening again, turning the world into a colorless blur. Your feet ache, your fingers are numb, but for the first time in days, the crushing weight of stupidity doesn't feel quite so heavy on your shoulders. Night falls, and the army makes camp in a small clearing. Fires flicker to life, casting golden halos in the swirling snow. You settle in, cloak wrapped tightly around you, and watch as a few soldiers roast something that may once have been a rabbit, or at least something rabbit-adjacent. Around the fire, stories begin to drift up like smoke, exaggerated tales of the great self-invasion, jokes about the generals leading you into your own backyards, wild theories about enemy spies disguised as snowmen. Historians still argue whether these tales grew into the larger-than-life legends they are today because the soldiers needed the morale boost or because the truth was too ridiculous to keep to themselves. You smile into the firelight, feeling the frostbite on your toes and the ache in your muscles, but also the warmth of something like camaraderie. Sure, you're lost. Sure, you've managed to invade yourselves not once but twice. But you're still here. And for tonight, that's enough. Morning stabs you awake with a shaft of cold light right to the face. You groan, shift, and immediately regret it. Every joint feels rusted, every muscle sore. The fire's nothing but a pile of sad, gray ashes. The stew pot is empty, save for some stubborn crust clinging to the sides like a bad memory. You roll to your feet, grimacing as the cold bites through your worn boots. Around you, the camp rouses in fits and starts. Men blink blearily at the pale sky, some still swaddled in their cloaks like miserable, oversized caterpillars. Another day, another opportunity to get lost. Historians still argue whether soldiers back then had any real sense of direction or if it was all just collective stubbornness disguised as strategy. Judging by the faces around you, it's clear no one has any great faith in today's navigation plans either. The general stands stiffly, clearing his throat loud enough to draw attention but not so loud as to make anyone expect too much. He announces the day's orders: head southeast. Definitely southeast. Maybe. You fall into formation with the others, crunching through the snow, breath puffing in small, annoyed clouds. The march begins again, slow and slogging, a moving illustration of human perseverance or maybe just human stubbornness. Hours pass. Or minutes. Time stretches and folds like cold taffy. The landscape changes subtly, trees thinning, the ground rising into low, frozen hills. You trudge up a slope, boots slipping on the hidden ice beneath the snow, and as you crest it, you spot something ahead. A town. Larger than the last few villages. A proper town, with stout wooden walls and a stone church whose steeple pokes into the sky like an accusatory finger. Smoke rises from chimneys. The scent of wood smoke and baking bread, real bread, reaches your nose and nearly makes you weep. But there's tension in the air. Soldiers around you shift nervously. Hands tighten on muskets. The officers huddle, squinting at the town. There's a flag fluttering from the tower. And here's the thing, it's not your flag. It's not Swedish. Not fully, anyway. Historians still argue whether this town was a neutral zone, a semi-independent pocket, or simply under the control of some minor noble who hadn't gotten the memo about loyalty to the crown. Medieval Sweden wasn't exactly a seamless quilt, it was more like a blanket someone's cat clawed at for a few centuries. You watch as a scout is dispatched, trudging cautiously toward the town gates. Minutes later, he returns, face tight with concern. Hostile, he says. Or close enough. Finally, an actual enemy. Excitement flickers through the ranks, thin and brittle but real. You shift your musket, fingers tingling with a mix of anticipation and frostbite. The general gives the order, prepare to engage. You line up, shoulder to shoulder, watching the town. No movement from the walls. No soldiers visible. Just the lazy drift of smoke and the slow, steady tolling of a bell, ominous, as if warning the townsfolk or maybe just ringing for your funeral in advance. You edge forward with the others, boots crunching in eerie unison. Your breath is loud in your ears. The town remains still, almost too still. And then, movement. Figures atop the walls, setting crossbows and muskets. Shouts, though you can't make out the words. Definitely not friendly. The first shots crack through the cold air. Smoke blooms from the town's defenses, and musket balls whistle overhead. One slaps into the snow near your foot, sending up a puff of white. You flinch but hold your ground. Around you, the army returns fire in a scattered, half-hearted volley. Most shots go wide, shooting accurately in a snowstorm while half-frozen isn't exactly a skill anyone mastered in training. Historians still argue whether this skirmish counted as a real battle or just a glorified slap fight. Either way, it's chaotic, clumsy, and cold. You reload, fumbling with frozen fingers, and fire again. Somewhere to your right, a soldier drops with a grunt, clutching his leg. Others shout, curse, duck behind whatever cover they can find, trees, rocks, each other. The general barks orders to advance. You surge forward, slipping and stumbling, more out of momentum than strategy. As you near the walls, the defenders retreat inside, slamming the gates behind them. A few more shots are fired, but it's clear they're not eager for close combat. The general calls a halt, and you gratefully sag against a rock, chest heaving. Siege time. Of course, no one has siege equipment, or ladders, or a plan. Historians still argue whether this was poor preparation or just classic overconfidence. You figure it's a little of both. For now, though, you huddle with the others, keeping an uneasy eye on the walls, hoping the town runs out of resolve, or food, before you run out of patience or toes. You steal a glance at the gray sky and the endless fields of snow stretching behind you. It's been days since you set out. Weeks? You're not sure anymore. All you know is that, for the first time in what feels like forever, you're not fighting yourselves. And that, you think grimly, has to count for something. You settle into the kind of siege that can only be described as reluctant. No roaring engines, no epic battering rams, no dramatic calls for surrender. Just a lot of shivering soldiers standing around in the snow, staring at a town full of equally cold, equally miserable defenders. The general barks out orders to build camp. You watch as tents are hastily thrown up, fires coaxed into life, and men shuffle into miserable little clumps for warmth. No one talks about strategy. No one really talks at all. The cold steals the words right out of your mouth. Historians still argue whether this siege was even intended to succeed or if it was simply a desperate attempt to look busy in front of any higher-ups who might wander by. In fairness, with supply lines frozen and maps barely worthy of a preschooler's crayon sketch, your options are limited. You spend the afternoon alternating between standing guard and stomping your feet to keep the blood moving. The snow's relentless. It worms its way into your boots, melts against your skin, and refreezes into little daggers of misery. At one point, a scout trudges back from a foraging mission, carrying a frozen rabbit that looks like it died of shame. The soldiers cheer anyway, meat is meat, and nobody's in a position to be picky. The highlight of your day, if it can be called that, is when one of the lieutenants decides to motivate the troops by reading from some tattered book of patriotic verses. His breath fogs the air with each noble line, but the effect is less stirring and more tragicomic. Halfway through, a soldier near the back starts snoring loudly. No one bothers to wake him. The villagers, for their part, seem just as unwilling to engage. You spot them occasionally peering over the walls, bundled up in every scrap of cloth they own, probably wondering who these frozen idiots are and why they haven't just given up and gone home yet. You don't blame them. You wonder the same thing yourself. Night falls quickly in the north. The sky turns a bruised purple, and the snow reflects what little light remains, casting the world into a ghostly half-glow. As you settle by the fire, you listen to the crackle of wood, the muffled groans of tired men, and the soft whisper of snow falling. It's almost peaceful if you squint and ignore the gnawing hunger and the fact that you're technically at war with a town smaller than your last family reunion. Someone starts passing around a flask, questionable contents, probably stronger than anything legally classified as drinkable. You take a swig, feeling the burn all the way down to your frozen toes. It doesn't make you warmer, but it feels like it does, which is close enough. Historians still argue whether alcohol helped or hindered soldiers during these miserable campaigns. Judging by the sudden outbreak of terrible singing, you lean toward the latter. You try to join in, but your teeth are chattering too much to carry a tune. No matter, no one's in tune anyway. The night drags on. You take your turn on watch, trudging a slow circuit around the camp, muskets slung heavy over your shoulder. The town sits silent under its blanket of snow, lights flickering faintly in windows. No attacks, no sneaky raids, just the steady, shared misery of people who really don't want to be doing this. Around midnight, a low murmur stirs the camp. Word filters through the ranks. The town has sent a messenger. You gather with the others as a small figure approaches the camp. No armor, no weapons, just a heavy cloak and a white cloth held high. The general steps forward, flanked by a few officers who look like they'd rather be anywhere else. The messenger stops a few paces away and, after a pause, throws back his hood. He's young, maybe 16, cheeks red with cold, but his voice is steady. Our mayor offers a proposal, he says, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Leave us be, and we will supply you with bread, salted fish, and beer until you pass on. You blink, stunned. A siege buyout. Historians still argue whether this was a desperate act of pragmatism or just a shrewd calculation. It's easier to feed the idiots than to fight them. The general doesn't answer right away. There's some hushed conferring. You catch snatches of words: supplies, morale, logistics. None of it sounds like a resounding no. Finally, the general steps forward. We accept. A ripple of cautious relief runs through the camp. No battle. No more snow-filled trenches. No more staring at the same walls, wondering who will starve first. As the boy disappears back toward the town, the soldiers begin to murmur. A few even smile. For the first time in days, the prospect of hot food feels almost real. You settle back by the fire, pulling your cloak tighter, stomach already growling in anticipation. Sure, it's not victory, but it's warm bread and salty fish. And in this frozen, foolish campaign, that's close enough to glory for you. The next morning smells different, like yeast and wood smoke and the faint promise of hope. You sit up, bleary-eyed and stiff, and blink at the sight before you, a line of villagers trudging carefully toward the camp, arms full of baskets and barrels. Bread, fish, beer. It's not a dream, although honestly, if it were, you'd still take it. Soldiers stagger to their feet, some still clutching blankets around their shoulders, as if afraid that sudden movement will shatter the fragile reality of actual food being delivered to their miserable camp. The villagers set down their offerings without ceremony and quickly retreat, their faces a masterclass in weary disdain. They want you gone. You want to be gone. It's a beautiful, if deeply awkward, mutual understanding. Historians still argue whether this arrangement was an early form of war tax or just good old-fashioned survival instinct on both sides. You elbow your way into the throng, snatch a loaf of bread, and tear into it with a desperation that would embarrass a starving wolf. It's dense, dry, probably a few days old, but it's warm, and it's real. You chew slowly, savoring the scratchy texture on your tongue like it's the finest feast you've ever had. Nearby, a soldier breaks open a barrel of fish, the brine wafting up in a pungent cloud. Men descend like gulls at a shipwreck, pulling out slippery fillets with gloved hands. Someone jokes about gourmet dining. No one laughs. It's not funny when it's true. You settle on a rock, bread in one hand, fish in the other, and gnaw thoughtfully. Around you, the camp hums with the unfamiliar energy of soldiers who are not actively plotting desertion. Spirits lift. The cold feels just a little less sharp. One of the officers, Lieutenant something or other, you're terrible with names, takes it upon himself to declare that morale is officially improved. He actually says it aloud, like he's marking the moment for posterity. Morale, he intones, is up. You tear another hunk of bread and think, for once, you're not wrong. Historians still argue whether this moment of low-key triumph is what kept the campaign from completely falling apart. Some say yes. Some say it was dumb luck. You figure it's probably a little of both, sprinkled with the kind of stubbornness that defines anyone willing to fight a war in the middle of a Swedish winter. As the day drags on, the camp relaxes. Fires burn higher. Boots are dried. Muskets are cleaned with a care that hasn't been seen in weeks. And the beer, sweet, watery, blissfully lukewarm beer, flows. You sip yours slowly, letting the faint bitterness wash over your tongue, feeling the tight coil of stress in your gut loosen just a notch. Across the fire, a few soldiers start a card game with dog-eared scraps of parchment and wager things like buttons and bootlaces. One guy offers up a whole roast fish as a prize. It's instantly the most hotly contested pot in the camp. By evening, you're full, for the first time in memory. You lean back against your pack, watching the smoke curl into the twilight sky. Conversation drifts around you, soft and aimless. Someone is telling a story about his hometown, a tiny speck on the coast where the winters are milder and the fish aren't frozen solid before you can cook them. Another guy brags, clearly lying, about having once punched a bear. No one bothers to call him on it. Let the man have his fantasy. Historians still argue whether soldiers in campaigns like this bonded more through shared misery or moments of brief, unexpected joy. Tonight, you feel like maybe it's both. The town remains quiet behind its walls. No attacks, no threats. Just the occasional flicker of torchlight, the outline of a guard pacing slowly along the ramparts. You wonder what they're thinking, watching you sit there, feasting on their reluctant generosity, not storming their gates but not exactly leading either. Peace by bread and fish. It's not in the war manuals, but maybe it should be. You're drowsy now, the fire's heat making your eyelids heavy. Somewhere nearby, someone is humming a tune. You recognize it, a lullaby your grandmother used to sing, low and soothing. The kind of song that feels like a blanket draped over your bones. The stars are sharp and cold above, scattered across the sky like shards of ice. The air smells of wood smoke and bread and a little bit of fish grease. For the first time in a long while, you feel almost human again. Morning comes not with the screaming of officers or the sudden panic of an ambush, but with a quiet, almost lazy sense of continuation. You blink awake, still half draped in your cloak, and realize the world hasn't ended overnight. The fire's burned low, but the embers are still warm. Your stomach, miraculously, still feels full. You sit up and stretch, joints popping, and glance around the camp. Men are stirring slowly, like reluctant cats, stretching and yawning and scratching in places you politely pretend not to notice. There's no urgency today, no shouted orders to break camp or polish boots until they gleam. Just the odd, contented murmur of men who, for once, aren't staring starvation in the face. The villagers, true to their word, arrive mid-morning with another delivery, more bread, more fish, more weak beer that tastes like it was strained through someone's old boot, but it's food, and food is gold out here. Historians still argue whether these daily tributes were out of fear, pragmatism, or just pure exhaustion. After all, besieging an enemy that's perfectly happy to feed you must rank pretty low on the list of effective military strategies. Today, though, there's a twist, a delegation. 5 villagers, led by a man who looks like he's been carved out of old oak, march into the camp. They're dressed plainly, but their postures are stiff with dignity. They stop a few feet from the general's tent, standing in that very specific way that says, "We're being polite, but not because we like you." The general emerges, pulling his coat tighter against the cold, and regards them with the air of a man who's just been handed a particularly complicated riddle. The head villager, gray beard, sharp eyes, steps forward and speaks without preamble. "We would like you to leave." Simple. Direct. No frills. You watch from a safe distance, biting down on a smile. Brave man, to talk to a general like that, even one presiding over the most embarrassingly polite siege in history. The general clears his throat. "And if we don't?" The old man shrugs. "Winter will do what it always does." Historians still argue whether this was a veiled threat or just an observation. Either way, it hits like a slap of cold air. Everyone knows what winter can do here, has done, countless times before. Armies don't win against winter. They just lose more slowly. The general pauses, fiddling with his gloves, before offering the world's most reluctant nod. "We'll consider your request." The villagers leave without another word, their dignity intact, their message delivered. Later, as you sit gnawing on a chunk of bread, you hear the officers talking, considering the request. In truth, they don't have much choice. Supplies are running out, despite the villagers' reluctant charity. Morale is a fragile thing, and the longer you sit here, the thinner it stretches. Besides, spring will come eventually. And with it, mud, glorious, morale-sapping mud that turns battlefields into soup and roads into swampy death traps. Historians still argue whether the generals truly believed they could hold out or whether they were just stalling for pride's sake. You figure it's probably the latter. Pride's a stubborn thing, even when it's half-frozen and sleep-deprived. That afternoon, an unofficial ceasefire is called. No guards posted. No scouts dispatched. Just a weary, tacit agreement to give it a rest. The soldiers relax. Some doze in the thin winter sun, cloaks pulled over their faces. Others play at cards or dice, gambling buttons and belt buckles and the occasional fishbone. You find a patch of bare earth by the fire, warm enough to be almost pleasant, and stretch out like a cat in a sunbeam. Later, someone breaks out a fiddle. The sound is thin and reedy, but it cuts through the cold, lilting and strange. A few men hum along, low and tuneless, but it's not about the music. It's about the normalcy, the illusion of home, of taverns and warm hearths and nights not spent worrying about where the next meal will come from. Historians still argue whether these moments of levity mattered in the grand scheme of the campaign. Some call them distractions. Others call them survival. You're inclined to believe the latter. You lean back, the earth cool against your spine, and let the music wash over you. No battles today. No chaos. Just a small, stubborn flame of humanity flickering in the heart of a very stupid war. And somehow, in spite of it all, you're still here. The unofficial ceasefire holds longer than anyone really expects. One day bleeds into the next in a slow, shivering drift of sameness. Snow falls, fires crackle, and meals of hard bread and fish appear with the same regularity as your grumbling stomach. You wake each morning to the same scene, soldiers fumbling with boots half frozen to the ground, smoke winding lazily toward a sky too gray and heavy to promise anything but more cold. The villagers arrive like clockwork, dump their offerings without a word, and retreat behind their walls. It's a routine. A frozen, awkward dance that neither side seems eager to end. Historians still argue whether this truce was an accident of circumstance or a low-key masterpiece of passive resistance. Either way, the days roll on, and not a single musket is fired. One afternoon, as you gnaw through yet another piece of bread dense enough to double as a weapon, you overhear the officers talking. Tension, brittle and thin, crackles between them. Maps are spread on the ground, pinned down by stones against the wind. You inch closer under the guise of adjusting your cloak, ears straining to catch snippets of the argument. No progress. Supplies won't last. Troops are restless. Command will demand a report. That last one draws a particularly long silence. Historians still argue whether the looming threat of a superior officer's wrath outweighed the risk of starving in the snow. Judging by the faces around that map, it's a tight race. You retreat to your fire, not wanting to be anywhere nearby if the argument escalates. You're not afraid of battle, you're afraid of the kind of decision-making that leads to brilliant ideas like invading yourself. Later, while gathering firewood, reed, desperately breaking twigs off half-dead trees, you spot movement at the village gate. A woman, bundled so tightly you can't tell her age, stands there, watching the camp. You freeze, not literally, but close, and raise a hand in greeting. She doesn't wave back, just stands there for a moment longer before disappearing inside. It's unsettling, in a way the usual frost and fear aren't. You shake it off and return to camp, arms full of kindling, heart beating a little faster than necessary. That night, as the fires burn low, word spreads like a cautious murmur. The villagers want another parley. The general looks like he's swallowed a nail when he hears this. Nevertheless, he agrees. Anything, at this point, is better than sitting here slowly turning into ice sculptures. You're not important enough to be part of the actual negotiations, but you're close enough to watch as they unfold. A delegation from the town arrives just before sunset. 5 figures, cloaked and hooded, faces obscured. They stand across from the general and his staff, stiff as fence posts. The leader steps forward, voice low but firm. You'll not take the town. Not this winter. It's not a threat. Not even a boast. Just a fact. The general bristles, but there's no real anger there. Only a deep, gnawing weariness. And what do you propose? He asks, voice rough with cold and something dangerously close to desperation. The villager shrugs. Go home. Come back in spring, if you must. But leave now, and no one has to die freezing in a ditch. You can almost see the words hit the officers like stones. Historians still argue whether this offer was bravery or calculated genius. Honestly, standing there watching, it just feels like common sense. The general hesitates. For a long moment, no one breathes. Finally, he nods. A wave of relief crashes invisibly over the camp. You feel it in your chest, see it in the way soldiers slump just a little, as if a burden has been lifted they hadn't even admitted they were carrying. The villagers nod once in return and vanish back into the night. The general turns to his officers. Prepare to march. Just like that, it's over. No battle. No grand speeches. Just the quiet, blessed release of a war that didn't happen. That night, as you sit by the fire one last time, the mood in camp is strange. Not jubilant, not even cheerful. Just quietly, cautiously hopeful. You gnaw on the last of your bread, staring into the embers, thinking about home. Historians still argue whether this retreat was a tactical blunder or a moral victory. You figure it's neither. It's survival. And sometimes, that's enough. The next morning, the camp wakes with something dangerously close to enthusiasm. It's not exactly joy, no one's breaking into song, but there's a bounce in a few steps, a touch more urgency in the way packs are tied and muskets are slung. Marching orders have a funny way of lifting spirits when the alternative is freezing to death in a siege no one really wanted in the first place. You shoulder your own pack, heavier now with odds and ends scrounged from abandoned supplies and borrowed from nearby trees. Your musket thumps against your back as you fall into the familiar trudge of formation. The path out is the same one you came in on, frozen ruts, snowdrifts waist deep in places, branches so heavy with ice they sag like they're giving up on life entirely. You glance back once. The village sits quietly behind you, its gates shut, smoke curling from chimneys into the steel-gray sky. No shouts of victory, no jeers. Just silence. A sort of true-shaped silence. Historians still argue whether the village ever realized just how close it came to becoming a smear in some forgotten military ledger. Probably not. Or maybe they did, and simply decided that feeding the invaders was cheaper than fighting them. You march. Hours stretch into a dull haze of aching feet and chapped faces. The army snakes through the countryside in a miserable, shuffling line, the only sounds the crunch of snow underfoot and the occasional, unavoidable sneeze. No one talks much. What's there to say? Nice war we didn't have? Congrats on not freezing to death before we got bored? Still, there's something oddly comforting in the shared silence. A collective sigh of relief, frozen and dragged along with the rest of your gear. You pass another village around midday. Smaller, sleepier. No walls, just a scattering of thatched roofs huddled against the wind. No smoke from chimneys, though. Empty, or hiding. Smart. Your general decides not to bother them. Probably a wise call, given recent history. Historians still argue whether this change in behavior marked a turning point in Swedish military tactics, a shift toward more caution and less catastrophic confusion. You're not convinced. More likely, everyone's just too tired to invade anything else, accidentally or otherwise. The day wears on, the light leaching from the sky until everything is bathed in that eerie twilight that isn't quite day or night. You camp in a hollow between two low hills, shielded from the worst of the wind. The fires burn low, more for comfort than heat. You sit hunched by the glow, gnawing on a strip of dried meat so tough you could probably use it to patch a boot. Across the camp, you spot the lieutenant, the one who declared morale was up a few days ago, trying to start a game of dice. He's not having much luck. Turns out, enthusiasm is hard to muster when your fingers are too stiff to hold the dice properly. You stretch out your legs, boots steaming faintly in the fire's heat, and let your mind drift. Home. You think about it more these days. About the simple things, a warm hearth, a loaf of fresh bread, a roof that doesn't leak and walls that don't creak with every gust of wind. You try to imagine walking through your own village gates again, alive and relatively intact. You wonder if you'll be able to explain this, how you spent a winter invading no one but yourselves, how the biggest victory was deciding not to be stupider than necessary. Historians still argue whether soldiers returning from campaigns like this one were celebrated or just quietly forgotten. Heroes? Villains? Mostly, just survivors. The fire crackles. The snow falls. Somewhere nearby, someone snores, oblivious and content. You pull your cloak tighter and let your eyes drift shut. Tomorrow, more marching. More frozen rivers to cross, more trees to dodge, more snow to curse under your breath. But tonight, you're not fighting anyone. Not even yourselves. And that, you figure, is the closest thing to peace you're likely to find out here. Morning seeps in slowly, as if even the sun can't be bothered to get up on time in this frozen wilderness. You peel open your eyes, blink against the pale gray light, and sit up stiffly. Every muscle protests, every joint creaks. It's not pain exactly, it's just your body's way of saying, maybe we don't do this again, yeah? The fires have burned to ash, and the camp stirs with reluctant life. Men stretch, shake the frost from their cloaks, stomp stiff boots into motion. No one's talking much, but there's a steady efficiency to the movement, the kind that only comes from people who've finally accepted that complaining won't thaw the snow or lighten the march. You shoulder your pack, heavier now with wet wool and disappointment, and fall into the line snaking its way out of the hollow. The road, if you can call it that, is a slurry of ice and frozen mud. You trudge along it, head down, watching your boots crunch through the crusted snow. The landscape rolls out in an endless expanse of white and gray, broken only by the occasional skeletal tree or frozen creek. Around mid-morning, a shout breaks the monotony. You look up, squinting against the pale glare. Riders. 3 of them, cloaks flapping, horses picking their way carefully through the snow. Messengers. You and the rest of the column slow, watching as they thunder past toward the front where the officers march. Historians still argue whether these riders carried news of actual strategic importance or just another set of baffling, contradictory orders. You'd wager on the latter. Word filters back down the line with typical army speed, that is to say, slowly and garbled. Bits and pieces reach your ears, something about a change of plans, a new route, a different target. You sigh. Deeply. The column halts, and you sag in place, grateful to stop even if it means more standing around in the cold. Up ahead, officers are arguing again, heads bowed over a fresh, no doubt useless map. Eventually, a new order makes its way to your ears. South. South? You squint at the horizon, at the indistinguishable blur of sky and snow. You don't have a compass. You don't trust anyone else to have one either. But south it is. You pivot, muscles protesting the sudden change, and begin the long shuffle in the new direction. By afternoon, the snow thickens, turning the world into a swirling mess of white. You pull your cloak tighter, tucking your face down into the wool, focusing on the boots ahead of you, on the rhythm of marching, step, slip, curse, repeat. Hours crawl by. The cold presses against you, through you, until you feel hollowed out, a walking icicle in a ragged cloak. And then, as if the world has decided you've suffered enough for one day, a shape looms ahead, a building, squat and dark against the snow. A church, maybe. Or an inn. Hard to tell. Historians still argue whether these outposts were abandoned due to war or winter. You don't care. You care that it has walls, a roof, and, hopefully, a fire inside. The column stirs, men perking up at the sight of shelter. Orders are shouted, cautious, wary. A small squad is dispatched to investigate. You wait, breath puffing out in anxious clouds, muscles tense. Minutes crawl past. Finally, a signal, safe. You move forward, a sluggish flood of relief washing over you. The building is a crumbling stone affair, but the door creaks open, and a wave of relatively warm air greets you. Inside, it's dark, smoky, but blessedly out of the wind. Someone's coaxed a fire to life in the hearth, and the scent of burning wood fills the air. You collapse near the fire, soaking up the meager warmth, feeling the ice in your bones crack and melt. Around you, the rest of the soldiers crowd in, grateful, silent. A few set to work making the place livable, patching gaps in the walls with cloaks, stacking wet wood to dry, wringing out sodden clothes. You lean back against the wall, cloaks pulled tight, and close your eyes. Historians still argue whether moments like these were the true victories of a soldier's life, brief, stolen comforts in a life otherwise defined by cold and chaos. You think maybe they're right. For tonight, at least, there's a roof over your head and a fire at your feet. You're not invading anyone. You're not being invaded. You're just existing, breathing, surviving. And in this war, that feels like the greatest triumph of all. Morning finds you stiff and half buried in the loose straw that litters the stone floor. The fire's nothing but faint orange embers now, barely holding on, much like the soldiers still curled around it like sleepy dogs. You sit up slowly, stretching arms that feel like they belong to someone twice your age. It takes a few long minutes to convince your legs to cooperate, and when you finally stand, the cold slides back in instantly, greedy and unwelcome. The officers are already awake, or maybe they never slept, hunched together in the corner, muttering over maps and scraps of parchment. You can tell from the tension in their shoulders and the way the lieutenant's eye is twitching that the news isn't good. Sure enough, word trickles down. Today's mission is to move. Again. Historians still argue whether this was strategic flexibility or just desperation on grand scale. Either way, you know the drill. Pack up, trudge on, try not to die in a ditch before lunch. You stuff your few belongings into your satchel, roll your cloak as best you can, and join the growing line of miserable humanity shuffling out into the snow. Today, the sky hangs low and heavy, promising more snow. The wind bites harder, like it knows you're getting used to its cruelty and is trying to stay one step ahead. The route is unfamiliar, winding through narrow passes and frozen fields that stretch out like blank parchment. Every few miles, the officers huddle around the map, frowning and gesturing, occasionally flipping it upside down, as if that might magically make it accurate. You trudge onward, head down, focusing on the small, immediate things, the crunch of snow underfoot, the way your breath curls out in pale plumes, the persistent ache in your toes that might mean frostbite or just another day of existing in northern misery. Around midday, you crest a low hill and see it, another village. Or what's left of one. Charred skeletons of houses jut from the snow, blackened beams reaching skyward like broken fingers. Smoke still rises from a few piles of rubble, though there's no sign of life. You swallow hard. Historians still argue about what happened to villages like this: enemy raids, bandits, desperate soldiers. The truth probably doesn't matter much to the people who used to live there. The general calls a halt. Scouts are dispatched. You watch them pick their way carefully through the ruins, muskets raised, but they don't find anything. Just silence and ash and the sharp, bitter stink of things that shouldn't have burned. The order comes down: move on. No supplies to scavenge here. No shelter worth salvaging. You pass through the village, boots crunching over blackened wood and crumbled stone. It feels wrong, like disturbing a grave. You keep your head down and your feet moving, trying not to think too hard about the lives that were here before yours tramped carelessly through the wreckage. By nightfall, the wind has picked up, howling low and mournful across the barren fields. Camp is made hastily, tents pitched with numbed fingers, fires kindled with stubborn determination. You sit close to the fire, arms wrapped around your knees, watching the flames sputter and spit. Someone passes a tin cup of thin broth, a miracle, considering the day's bleak prospects. You sip it carefully, savoring the brief, briny warmth. Around you, the camp murmurs in low tones, half-hearted jokes, quiet stories, the occasional curse muttered under breath. No one mentions the ruined village. No one really has to. Historians still argue whether moments like this were the glue that held armies together or the cracks that made them fall apart. You figure it's both. Shared misery is a strange kind of bond. The stars come out, sharp and cold against the black sky, scattered like shards of ice. You lean back, staring up, letting the heat of the fire seep into your bones as you drift towards sleep. Another day gone. Another village pass. Another step closer to, well, something. Maybe home. Maybe just another mistake on a long list of them. But you're still here. And for tonight, that's enough. The next morning arrives late, as if even the sun is too tired to bother with this foolish march. You crack open your eyes, groaning at the stiffness that seems to have multiplied overnight. Every joint, every muscle protests, but you've long since stopped expecting your body to cooperate. The fire's burned out, leaving nothing but a dark smudge on the snow. Around you, soldiers are already stirring, shaking the frost from their cloaks, stamping frozen feet into reluctant motion. There's a different energy today, tense, coiled. Whispers ripple through the camp like wind through dry grass. One of your comrades leans close, breath misting. They say someone's missing. You frown. It's not unheard of. Desertion happens, especially when the only reward for loyalty seems to be an early grave. But desertion doesn't usually send a shiver down the spine of an entire camp. Turns out, it's not just anyone. It's one of the officers. Historians still argue whether he slipped away into the night out of cowardice, desperation, or sheer good sense. All you know is that he's gone, and with him, the last pretense that anyone has a real plan. The general calls an emergency meeting, dragging the other officers into a hasty, furious huddle. Voices rise, sharp and urgent, but the snow and the distance muffle the words. You watch from your place by the extinguished fire, chewing on a piece of jerky so tough it might as well be leather. Around you, the other soldiers pretend not to care, but their eyes keep drifting toward the officers, toward the argument that promises nothing good. Eventually, the general straightens, face grim, and bellows the new order: march. Where? Still south, apparently. Still toward whatever nebulous target exists beyond the next snowy hill. You fall in line, shoulders hunched against the wind. The march is slower today. The missing officer's absence hangs over the column like a cloud, heavy and ominous. The terrain shifts, less open fields, more dense, skeletal woods. The trees creak and groan under their weight of ice, branches drooping like tired soldiers. The ground underfoot turns treacherous, hidden patches of ice waiting to send the unwary sprawling. By midday, the snow begins again. Thick, lazy flakes that cling to your cloak and eyelashes, blurring the world into a haze of white. Visibility drops. You lose sight of the men ahead and behind, reduced to following the muddy, frozen footprints in front of you like some miserable breadcrumb trail. Historians still argue whether this was the turning point, the moment when the army stopped being an army and started being a collection of individuals moving in roughly the same direction. You stumble along, muscles burning, boots soaked through. You stopped feeling your toes hours ago. The only thing keeping you upright is habit and the faint, stubborn ember of survival. At some point, the column grinds to a halt. You can barely see why at first, squinting into the swirling snow. A clearing. A crossroads, marked by a signpost nearly buried in snow. The words are illegible, the wood weathered and worn. The officers argue again, right there in the snow, pointing in different directions, voices sharp with cold and fraying tempers. Go left? Right? Forward? Back? You stand there, breath heaving, heart thudding in your ears, and realize with grim clarity, they have no idea where they are. Historians still argue whether maps were even useful at this point or if the officers were just arguing to make it look like they were doing something. Eventually, a decision is made. Forward. You march again, deeper into the woods, deeper into the storm. The snow thickens, muffling the world into a heavy, oppressive silence. Time loses meaning. Hours? Days? You could be moving in circles for all you know. And then, a shout. You jolt, heart leaping. Up ahead, a figure staggers into view, cloaked, snow-caked, waving frantically. It's the missing officer. He's wild-eyed, half-frozen, mumbling incoherently as the officers swarm around him. You catch snippets as the wind shifts. Wrong way, enemy patrol, too close. Historians still argue whether he was warning you or trying to lead you astray. Either way, the reaction is the same, panic. Orders are barked. Men scramble into formation, fumbling with muskets and swords, tripping over each other in the snow. You feel it, the surge of adrenaline, the sharp, electric terror that cuts through the numbness. You tighten your grip on your musket, heart hammering. You don't know who or what is coming. You just know that, for the first time in days, the enemy might not be yourselves. The enemy doesn't crash down on you like a hammer. No, they seep through the snow and mist, slow and silent as a bad idea creeping through the back of your mind. You stand frozen, no pun intended, musket clenched tight, scanning the blur of trees and snowfall ahead. Shapes materialize, ghosts in gray coats, weapons gleaming faintly where the snow hasn't swallowed them. A sharp command is shouted, not in your language. Historians still argue whether this was an actual enemy patrol or just another confused band of soldiers just as lost as you are. In the moment, it doesn't matter. They look like the enemy. That's enough. The first shot cracks through the stillness, startling birds from their perches high in the trees. You don't know who fires first. Maybe you. Maybe them. Maybe the snow itself grew tired of watching. What follows can hardly be called a battle. It's a clumsy, half-blind scramble. Muskets misfire in the wet cold. Powder refuses to light. Men trip, stumble, shout, curse. You fire once, twice, then fumble with frozen fingers to reload. A figure charges at you, saber flashing. You lurch backward, slipping on a patch of ice and landing hard enough to rattle your teeth. The saber whistles harmlessly above your head. Scrambling up, you swing the butt of your musket, catching the attacker in the ribs. He crumples with a grunt, lost in the swirling snow. Around you, chaos reigns. Friends and enemies alike are indistinguishable in the storm, gray on white, movement without meaning. Historians still argue whether there were more casualties from frostbite or friendly fire. You believe it's probably an even split. The officers shout conflicting orders, hold the line, fall back, advance, each barked command layered over the last until the words lose all meaning. Your breath rasps in your throat, each inhale burning. You reload, fire, reload again, the movement's mechanical, ingrained. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the fighting ebbs. Shapes retreat into the mist, swallowed up by the snowstorm. Shouts fade. Musket fire dwindles to isolated pops. You're left standing, panting, the world eerily quiet once more. Around you, men stagger, limp, slump to the ground. A few bodies lie twisted in the snow, their faces slack, their uniforms indistinct under the frost. No one speaks. There's nothing to say. You slump down against a tree, musket across your lap, breath steaming in great, shuddering clouds. Every muscle trembles, from exhaustion or cold or just sheer disbelief. Historians still argue whether this skirmish had any real strategic impact. You suspect it will be just another forgotten footnote, a casualty of poor maps and poorer planning. As the surviving officers regroup, they exchange grim looks. They know, everyone knows, this was a disaster. You spend the night right there, too tired and too broken to move. Fires are lit sparingly, hidden from sight. Wounds are bound with strips of torn cloaks. Supplies, already thin, are inventoried with somber care. You wrap yourself tighter in your cloak, sinking into the snow, and stare up at the sky. No stars tonight. Just an endless, suffocating gray. Someone starts humming, a low, tuneless sound. A few others join in, not really a song, just noise to keep the dark at bay. You close your eyes and let the numbness take over. When sleep finally comes, it's not the deep, restorative kind. It's the shallow, restless doze of a soldier too cold and too tired to dream. But you're still breathing, still here. And somehow, against all odds and logic, you've managed to survive another day. Dawn scrapes its way over the horizon, dragging light so faint it barely counts as morning. You pry open your eyes, groggy and stiff, the cold having crept so deeply into your bones it feels permanent. Around you, the camp stirs sluggishly. Men grunt and groan as they force themselves upright, clinging to the miserable remnants of warmth left in their threadbare cloaks. The fires have burned low, and even the smoke seems tired, curling only a few feet before surrendering to the heavy, still air. You stand, wincing at the stab of pain in your knees, and sling your musket over your shoulder. The ground is hard, the snow packed tight and stained here and there with the ugly brown smudges of battle and fire. Today, there's no debate about moving. The officers are grim-faced, no more discussions or maps held sideways. It's a retreat. Even they can't dress it up any other way. Historians still argue whether it was cowardice, pragmatism, or a rare flash of actual wisdom that convinced the general to pull out. You don't care. You're just grateful to be walking away for once, not toward another disaster. The army, or what's left of it, forms a ragged line and begins to march. No drums, no banners. Just the steady, defeated crunch of boots over snow. You glance around at your comrades. Hollow-eyed, limping, wrapped in cloaks patched and threadbare, they look less like an army and more like a column of refugees. In a way, that's what you are now. The day passes in a slow, agonizing crawl. The cold is sharper today, slicing through the layers of wool and leather like knives. Your breath comes in ragged clouds, each exhale a small, defiant statement, still here, still breathing. Historians still argue whether the winter of that year was particularly brutal or just another in a long line of miserable Scandinavian seasons. It's academic. For you, this is the worst it's ever been. You march until the sun sinks, and the sky bruises purple and black. No fires tonight, too dangerous. The enemy, whoever they were, could still be near. You settle onto the frozen ground, wrapping your cloak tight, and chew on a piece of bread so hard it feels like gnawing on a rock. It's not enough, but it's all there is. A few soldiers murmur to each other, voices low and raw. You catch fragments, talk of home, of families left behind, of spring, as if the seasons will ever turn again. Historians still argue whether these moments of shared suffering forged a stronger brotherhood among soldiers. In the cold and the dark, the only brotherhood you feel is one of mutual, miserable endurance. You lie back and stare up at the sky, at the faint glimmer of stars barely visible through the mist and cloud. You think of how far you've come, and how far you still have to go. And you think, not for the first time, about how this all started. A wrong turn. A village mistaken for an enemy stronghold. Orders shouted into blizzards, maps more dream than guide. You wonder if, someday, this will be told as a joke in the taverns, a tale of soldiers so lost they invaded their own people. You hope so. Better a laughingstock than a ghost. You close your eyes against the cold and let sleep claim you, shallow and uneasy. Tomorrow will bring more marching, more cold, more uncertainty. But for now, you rest. You survived today. And for the first time in a long while, you dare to believe you might survive tomorrow, too. The final morning arrives wrapped in silence, the kind that feels less like peace and more like the world holding its breath. You wake slowly, muscles stiff, fingers numb, heart heavy with the weight of countless frozen miles behind you. The camp stirs quietly. No cheers, no fanfare, just the tired, slow awakening of men who have seen too much and lived to tell little of it. The fires are embers, the bread stale, the spirits barely flickering. Today, the order is simple: march home. Not to victory. Not to glory. Just home. The line forms, ragged, exhausted, bone-weary, and begins the long, slow trek back through snow-draped forests and frozen fields. You follow, boots heavy, breath ragged, each step a small rebellion against the cold and the past. Historians still argue whether this retreat was a defeat or a mercy, a failure or survival. You know it was a little of both. As you march, memories float like ghosts, villages mistaken for enemies, dinners shared over reluctant stew, snowball fights in the middle of nowhere, the endless cold biting and relentless. You remember the laughter too, awkward, broken, and fleeting, but real. In the quiet moments, you think of the soldiers who didn't make it back, their faces lost in the blur of snow and time. You carry them with you, a silent testament to the folly and the endurance of men caught in a war that was, in many ways, against themselves. The sky softens, the snow lightens, and somewhere ahead, you glimpse the faint outline of a familiar ridge, the promise of home. You breathe in the sharp, cold air and let the memories wash over you like the winter winds, harsh, biting, but carrying a strange kind of beauty. You are weary. You are broken. But you are still here. And as the sun dips low, casting long shadows over the endless white, you realize that sometimes, surviving the war within is the greatest victory of all. The cold is still there. The snow still falls. But you have walked through the storm and come out the other side. You trudge on, step by step, toward a future uncertain but undeniably yours. And with that, your journey ends, not with a battle cry, but with the quiet strength of survival. The cold has finally softened, like a deep exhale after a storm too long endured. The snowflakes drift gently, settling over the worn paths you've walked countless times, cloaking the world in a hush that feels almost sacred. You sit quietly, the weight of your cloak pulling you gently downward, as the day's harsh edges blur into a soft, fading glow. Your breath curls in the air, small clouds of warmth in the chill, and you listen, not to the roar of battle, but to the quiet heartbeat of the earth beneath the snow. The woods around you seem to lean in, their branches whispering forgotten tales, the wind weaving through them a lullaby only the patient can hear. The memories of confusion, cold, and chaos settle like snowdrifts in your mind, not buried but transformed, softened by time and distance. That self-invasion, that blunder stitched into the tapestry of history, becomes less a mark of shame and more a curious story whispered over firesides, a testament to human folly and resilience. You feel the slow, steady pulse of survival in your veins, a quiet victory earned in the freezing silence between mistakes. The faces of comrades lost and friends found flicker gently like shadows in a dying fire, their stories woven with yours in the cold fabric of this strange winter. As dusk deepens, your eyelids grow heavy, and the world fades into a gentle blur. You breathe in the soft hum of night, the calm beneath the stars, and let yourself drift, safe, warm, and at peace. You made it through the storm. You are still here. And now, it's time to rest. Sweet dreams.